Welcome to MHN Voices, our series through which we present insightful discussions among industry thought leaders, moderated by our editorial team. Today, we're talking about fair housing laws, best practices for compliance, and strategies for avoiding violations and complaints. I'm Suzanne Silverman, editorial director of Multi-Housing News, and today we have a mix of experts representing different fair housing considerations, including consultant Ann Sadovsky, Sharon Géno, president of the National Multifamily Housing Council, Todd Watkins, co-founder, COO, and general counsel for RailField Partners, Sheila Salmon, an attorney with Reno and Cavanaugh, and Sarah Saadian, senior vice president of public policy and field organizing for the National Low Income Housing Coalition. We're recording this session, and it'll be available for later viewing. In addition, we're going to leave some time at the end to answer your questions, but please feel free to submit them at any time during the webinar. And thank you to those of you who submitted some in advance. We'll try to get to as many as possible. Let's start by outlining today's top fair housing concerns, both from the operators and the residents' perspectives. Let's start with the operators, and Ann, why don't you launch our conversation?
I am excited to do that. Thank you. So I made a list of all the things that we need to be concerned about today. Like you really needed a few more things added to your tasks. But in my opinion, as a fair housing instructor, the hottest topics for us today as housing providers, understanding that HUD continues funding millions of dollars to local housing authorities to send out shoppers and testers. It is not illegal. It is no different than if you're driving 80 miles an hour and crest a hill in a 30-mile zone and the officer steps out with his thing and says stop and you get a ticket. That's what shoppers and testers are doing. So it is not illegal, and HUD has approved it and continues funding it. So make friends with your local housing authority. They are not your enemies. If you have questions about your occupancy standards, if you're not sure about certain policies, we stand by and stick with HUD's guidelines as housing providers, but your local housing authorities add protected classes. So we want to stay current, and we need to look for ways to prevent being biased. We need to be sure that we treat people equally with equal opportunity. Stay current. Taking a fair housing class once a year is no longer enough. Research, get on the internet. Again, talk to your local housing authority. If you have a local apartment association, go to the meetings and really stay on top of what's going on. So there are just a few more quick things I want to mention. The 7 protected classes have now been added to and I just made a few notes of things so that you'll understand what I'm talking about here. Under, for example, race. So people come to let me review quick. Race. Your national race is your ethnicity. Color is the color of your skin. National origin, if you were born in another country than here. So get sure about the definitions and know that those are all protected classes. And then the additions are that HUD now says that under race, the person can sue you for some comment about their ethnicity, their religion, their hairstyle. All of these things apply. So I'm just going to do my part opening just by saying train, educate. One other quick thing is I get often asked, should we have a fair housing officer or should we let the managers handle all of it? And I'm not knocking the managers. They're already on overload. But I think it is smart for you to have a person in your organization where the managers can turn to them with fair housing questions, where we could direct an unhappy resident or somebody with a local housing authority. And they're not attorneys. They're not 100% perfect with the laws, but one person or one group within your organization to handle it. It isn't fair to dump that on your on-site team. And that's my opening remarks.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk from the resident side. Sarah, why don't we hear from you?
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak directly to folks on the ground who are providing housing. Like I said, I'm Sarah Saadian. I'm with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and we focus on racially and socially equitable public policy to ensure that people with the lowest incomes have quality, affordable homes and communities of their choice. And so the issue at hand today about fair housing is really key to our mission. And this summer, we published a National Tenants Bill of Rights with our partners, which provides a comprehensive look at what are the renter protections that are really needed to prevent housing instability and homelessness, address longstanding racial and social inequities, and advance housing justice. That was an 18-month process where we worked directly with tenants to help write it. And we heard a lot from tenant leaders that one of their major concerns is about the need to address discrimination and harassment. And I think that's really central to our conversation today about fair housing. What they have told us is that they still see that discrimination and harassment playing out in their daily lives, and it has a tangible impact on their ability to live stably and comfortably in their homes. What's helpful to know also is that we've seen a rise in fair housing complaints in recent years. So the National Fair Housing Alliance reports that was 34,000 complaints that were filed with HUD or with local organizations this year. That's the highest on record. For the last 3 years, it's been the highest on record. And so we can safely assume that there are many more people who have experienced discrimination and harassment, but who aren't filing complaints. So this is a major issue that needs to be addressed because the relationship between tenants and landlords has a direct impact on how people can live in their homes. And until we're facing these issues head on, we'll continue to see renters be put in places where they're experiencing this sort of harassment, or in worst cases, being pushed out of their homes and into homelessness. So again, I appreciate you for centering tenants in this conversation in this way.
We'd really like to have a well-rounded discussion, so it's very helpful. Thanks for being here. Before we get into policy updates, does anybody have any other top fair housing concerns that haven't been mentioned so far?
I want to just say one quick thing about social media. Naturally, the complaints will continue to grow as long as everybody is on social media saying my manager did this, or my company did this to me, or and so people are posting when they feel like they've been discriminated against, and it does reminding others that so social media is a big part of, I will use the word exposure, but I think most appropriate would just be complaints, because we're not always exposing something. They think they are, but not always. So
Thank you.
I'm not sure if it's like I mean, I guess there's a little, I guess as an operator, there's some assumptions, I think, in maybe what Sarah was saying, that the fact that there have been more complaints don't necessarily mean that there have been more discrimination. It means that people are making more complaints. And I'm not sure, and I think that one of the issues as an operator that we see is, people, if you spend 18 months and you put out a 900-page report and you send it to everyone, you will get more people who are complaining, but it doesn't always mean that, that operators are bad people, or that there is more discrimination going on. And I think one of the issues that we have to deal with is that some people are actually just when they don't like something, they then fit it into a rubric that is now termed discrimination. And so there is a lot more litigation, there's no doubt about that, but I'm not sure there's necessarily that much more discrimination. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Good point. Thank you, Todd. So let's talk about the most significant recent policy updates that property managers should be aware of. And Sheila, if you could start us off on that one, that would be very helpful.
Sure. Thank you, Suzanne. And I appreciate the opportunity to speak to this group. As Suzanne said, I am an attorney. I'm a partner at the firm of Reno and Cavanaugh, and my practice does center largely around representing owners and managers and operators of assisted housing. So I come at this from the operator's perspective. In terms of policy updates, I would say HUD's been very busy, particularly FATO, over the last couple of years. In the last year alone, HUD has issued one final rule, and that would be the rule reinstating HUD's discriminatory effects rule. And then it's 3 proposed rules, one which detailed the changes in VAWA, which is the Violence Against Women's Reauthorization Act of 2022. A proposed rule that would make permanent the 30-day notice requirement before pursuing an eviction for non-payment of rent. That was something that was put in place during the pandemic, but HUD is now attempting to make that a permanent requirement. And then I think most significantly is the criminal screening rule that was published in April of this year, which seeks to, in HUD's words, standardize the process of considering criminal records in both the admissions decisions as well as termination and evictions decisions. I see it a little differently, and we can talk about that a little bit in a few minutes, but that has been, as I said, probably the most significant update recently. And in addition, HUD has just been issuing various other guidance, including guidance on the use of AI, artificial intelligence, in the tenant screening and advertising context. And then putting out various other guidance, particularly geared towards applicants and tenants in an attempt to inform them of their rights in terms of their rights during the screening process and, you know, whether or not, and when they feel discriminated, what they can do to address that. So I think that's, you know, a synopsis of the most significant updates.
Okay, thanks. Sharon, anything else you want to add to that, or is that pretty much cover everything?
Suzanne, and thank you for having us here today. As you know, the National Multifamily Housing Council is a trade association of over 2,000 members that participate in the multifamily space. That includes lenders, investors, as well as owners, operators, and managers. So the fair housing issue is a very critical issue to our membership. In addition to the things that Sheila mentioned, I'll mention one more that's still percolating. A couple years ago, the department put back out the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. And we're still seeing the impact of how that's going to play out in communities. And what that does effectively is it requires recipients of federal dollars to explain in a plan how the work that they're doing in their expenditure of those dollars is moving the fair housing goals and objectives. I think the biggest fair housing issue we have today is a lack of a sufficient supply of housing. We just do not have enough housing. And when you don't have enough of something, who does that impact the most? It impacts many of the most vulnerable populations, including the folks that are in the protected classes under the Fair Housing Act. So I think and some things are being used at the local level to prevent or delay the construction and the development of the housing that we need, mostly multifamily housing. And that is a double-edged sword. Policies that sometimes aren't intended to do that, like some of the environmental policies and other things, can be used as a weapon to prevent more multifamily housing and particularly keep people in protected classes out of certain communities. Rent control is another thing that can be used by communities to deter investment in the multifamily housing that we need. And who does that impact the most? It impacts those people in those protected classes. So that's something I think we all should continue to keep our eyes on as we move forward and we try to grapple with this really acute housing crisis that we have, shortage that we have, that has resulted in some affordability issues as well.
And Sarah, what further updates are underway, maybe likely to be implemented, and how might that change depending on who wins the upcoming election?
I think this is a great question because there couldn't be an issue that is better at crystallizing the differences between the policies that President Trump might pursue or that a President Harris might pursue. If you look back to the first Trump administration, the place where they were able to do the greatest harm, in my opinion, was around fair housing laws. We saw them have a lot of flexibility to abruptly rescind and replace the affirmatively furthering fair housing law. We saw a major step back away from fair housing enforcement, an undermining of the disparate impact rule. And the reason why they were able to do so much harm there was because there's a lot more flexibility given to HUD around those issue areas. Whereas other places where they wanted to pursue policy changes, they would have to go through Congress. And so I think if we see another Trump administration, we'll likely see them take similar steps or more steps to undermine fair housing. That seemed to be a central focus of theirs last time around. In terms of changes right now, just to build on Sharon's point earlier, HUD has put out this proposed rule around affirmatively furthering fair housing, building on the 55-year plus legislative legal requirement under the Fair Housing Act. We saw some important changes that were made or proposed under that rule to enhance community engagement, to provide for greater transparency, to make sure that communities are annually evaluating their progress towards reaching their fair housing goals. We're disappointed that the Biden administration hasn't released a final rule and likely won't do so before the election. We think that's a missed opportunity because clearly if a Trump administration comes in, that's not going to be one of their priorities. In fact, you might very well see them go back to the old policy that was in place. The other change that we might see on the horizon, sort of that's outside of the context of the election, is around the Federal Housing Finance Agency, which oversees Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Starting last summer, they issued a request for information looking for feedback from both landlords and tenants about how they could create tenant protections on properties that receive a federally backed mortgage. And just this summer, they've proposed their first policy changes that move in that direction. From our opinion, that's very modest, the sort of changes they were looking at, things like a 30-day notice requirement of any rent increases, 30-day notice for any lease termination, and 5 days to cure any late payment. If any landlord's not already providing those sorts of notice requirements, then hopefully this can help steer them in the right direction. But we want to see FHFA go even further by imposing much more robust renter protections on federally backed mortgages, things like source of income protections, just cause eviction standards, habitability and accessibility requirements, and anti-rent gouging protections as ways to shift more power away from landlords and into the hands of renters.
So let's put a little bit of perspective on this before we really get into the nuts and bolts of what best practices. So Sheila, from an operator's standpoint, going back to what HUD's been doing and could be doing, how is HUD perceived right now? Is it perceived as over managing the process or not? And what are the risks and concerns of that?
From an owner's and operator's perspective, I would say that HUD is seen as overreaching and over managing and attempting. And I think the criminal screening rule, proposed rule, is a perfect example of substituting its judgment for that of the owner or the manager. I mean, starting in 1998 through the Quality Housing and Work Responsibility Act, owners and managers were given a fair amount of discretion to screen for criminal activity, criminal history, in an effort to, ideally screen out people who would pose some sort of threat or would in some way interfere with the quiet enjoyment of the tenant population. HUD has really spent the last 20+ years in an effort to roll that back. And so the owners see this proposed rule as a culmination of that 20+ year effort. And so in our opinion, and we wrote comments on this on behalf of several industry organizations, through this rule, HUD diminishes, or in some instances takes away, the discretion that's afforded by statute without any legal basis for doing so. And at the same time, in doing this, there is a concern that this type of effort on HUD's part will disincentivize participation in HUD programs. That owners will start to see that there's just too much discretion being taken away, too much of a burden being placed on owners to do all the things that this rule would require them to do. The other concern is, and HUD has gone so far as to say this. First of all, HUD doesn't think you should do criminal screening at all, although it hasn't gone that far in its proposed rulemaking. But HUD is also suggesting that perhaps credit and evictions history are not a valid basis or a reliable basis upon which to screen applicants. That information will not necessarily give you a good picture of who will be a good tenant. I don't know what that leaves, because HUD is very clear. You have the program eligibility requirements, and then you have the suitability requirements. So there just seems to be this ongoing effort to move forward to take away some of the screening tools that owners and managers have relied on for years. We've also seen stepped up enforcement, as Sarah mentioned. During the Trump administration, there probably was a backing off. I don't know if this is in an effort to make up for lost time, but I can tell you, I've been an attorney for over 30 years, and until a few years ago, I had never seen a Title VI compliance review and a VCA resulting from that. Now you see them all the time. They've stepped up their enforcement under Title VI. They're doing more compliance reviews. And now VAWA, under the reauthorization of 2022, is supposed to be implementing a compliance review process as well. That act also purportedly gives HUD enforcement powers to enforce VAWA in the same manner it enforces the Fair Housing Act. So all of these things, I think the owners are just looking at from like, wow, why do we want to do this anymore? So I think that's the biggest risk, is the burdens being placed on the owners and managers, and the potential for disincentivizing people for the continuing to participate in the program. And that will lead to an even bigger housing crisis in terms of available housing, especially affordable housing. And one other thing I wanted to mention that I should have mentioned before, HUD has also initiated an effort that's been going on for several years now to amend Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which applies only to recipients of federal financial assistance. HUD has taken this posture that even though the law itself only requires certain older buildings to make their buildings accessible under certain prescribed circumstances, HUD's posture these days is like, well, we just assumed that the owners would eventually update their properties in such a way that they'd be fully accessible. So HUD has put out this advanced notice of proposed rulemaking, seeking input from the public about issues relating to accessibility and revising those regulations.
And Sarah, if we could go back to you on this, what's the residents' perspective? Is there enough enforcement? What are some other ideas for enforcement without discouraging landlords from adding property? And how do you make housing fair for both sides?
Yeah, and I think all of our speakers here are really hitting on the challenge that's underlying this, that there's a delicate balance that needs to be done to make sure that landlords have a very clear expectation and advance notice of what standard they'll be held to, and that tenants also have this expectation that when there's a violation, that something will be done and that the landlords would be held accountable. So it's really challenging to do. So it's not as though I have all the answers, but at least from a tenant perspective, it's clear that the current enforcement framework that we have is not really providing the protections that renters need, or holding landlords accountable for any abusive or predatory actions that they might be taking in. Some lower hanging fruit or easier things to conceive of in terms of enforcement would be increasing investments in monitoring and enforcement by government agencies and housing organizations. Only about 1 in 5 complaints are ever addressed. And so most of the time, tenants' complaints are really left without any sort of resolution at all. There needs to be stronger penalties against landlords who have recurring violations. So if HUD or another entity finds that a landlord continues to engage in discrimination, they should no longer be eligible to get a federally backed mortgage from FHFA. That I think could help distinguish between those landlords that are doing a good job and trying their best to uphold the law and follow those protections, but to hold those landlords that are, continually engaging in predatory behavior accountable. And then harder things to see, but other options on the horizon are things like many communities have been moving to right to counsel when it comes to eviction court. But, we could be providing access to legal counsel when it comes to asserting fair housing and civil rights laws, or allowing renters to use landlord harassment as a defense in eviction court, or even creating a private right of action when harassment is taking place. And I think when you put those sort of mechanisms in place, you might see that there's an easier way to find resolution between landlords and renters.
So let's get into some of this nuts and bolts of how to effectively handle requests and complaints and resolve things in the best ways. And Anne, you were referring earlier to your feeling that there should be a point person in the company that really is the one that everything ultimately goes to, so that they are handling things consistently. Is there more you wanted to add to that?
Just that, Ray, I have a client here in Dallas who all the complaints are sent in to his HR person. And again, she's not an attorney. She's not a fair housing specialist. She's the one who gets the information and makes sure that it's funneled to the right person. If their attorney needs to be involved, if there needs to be better training for the managers, the way they deal with things. So, and I laughed and said, you dump it all on one person, you've got a big property management company, they'll be bald in a month because they'll pull out every hair in their head, getting all of that piled on them. But I just, where I've seen it work with some of the clients that I work with, it has been great relief to the on-site people. The managers live in fear because they can be named party to a lawsuit, just like a leasing consultant, just like you or I can be. So I do think it would be good to have maybe a specialist, a resource person that will take it and run with it from there and relieve the on-site people.
And bring in who's needed.
Yes.
Does anybody else have anything to add, or any different views on that?
I mean, could go back for 1 second, because I think one of the things that we were talking about, one side thinks we're over enforced, the other side thinks we're under enforced. I think part of the problem is there's the way this regime is sort of dealt with overall, just the overall way it is managed it's litigious, right? It always has to end up. It seems like we need to have some kind of buffer, safe harbor or something for people who are, trying to do the right, or think they're doing the right thing, or not there. But the idea that you either discriminated and should go to prison effectively, or never get another Fannie loan or whatever, or you're doing everything perfectly and, just go on and do it because, that's what you were supposed to do in the first place. It seems to me that there's got to be some way in the beginning, because as I just, an operator, look at all this stuff, you guys talk about, section 206 and what's the VC, the vice, all these sort of things that I can tell you on the ground, no one is thinking about. And so there needs to be some way to I guess to find a way so that people on the ground can actually manage this. So one of the things that I kept thinking about was we have a property that has two sets of gets vouchers from both a city and a county. And so we have two jurisdictions over the same property. We had the same violations, and they took decidedly different measures. They took decidedly different approaches on it. So what do you say to that one leasing agent who's got to figure out where you come from first, where your voucher money is coming from without discriminating against their source of income, of how they should be handling it? There are so many places where things actually where the rubber hits the road, where people aren't looking at lofty principles and policies and meta-analysis, where they have to actually make decisions. And I feel like, this is why they don't let me in these rooms with, Sarah and Sharon, where they make these big decisions. But, someone has to sort of practically say, put yourself in that person's shoes. How are they possibly going to make that decision? And I think that to some degree, all we've been talking about needs to be sort of blown up to look at it from the bottom up instead of the top down, and say, how do we help these people actually do their job? Because just as, Anne likes to say, the guy from the tester is just doing their job. The leasing agent is just doing their job. They're not actively trying. I believe, Sarah, you can take issue with it. I don't believe they are actively trying to discriminate against somebody. They don't know what, they're doing what they can, just to get through their day, to get back home to their family. So I feel like that, there's some measure in which, this discussion is a little narrow in that it's sort of pushed against pushed inside the same paradigm that we've had for a long time.
Yeah, I want to just echo Todd's comments. We all want the same thing. Residents and housing providers, and I think all of us here want to live in that country where there is enough quality housing in the neighborhoods that we want to live in, of a different size and shape and configuration for the different times in life when people need them. That is housing opportunity. That is fair housing. So that's the goal we're all trying to achieve. But I agree with Todd. The Fair Housing Act, in my view, and I practiced in this area for many years, has a very robust enforcement rubric, because you have the HUD complaint, you have a DOJ filing, you have a local state or local entity that can also file a complaint, you have testers, and you have a private right of action. And you can file it both on an individual basis, and you can file it under a disparate impact claim. So there's a lot of opportunity, but it's all, to Todd's point, focused around this gotcha game. One of the things that we've done at MHC in an effort to try to get out of some of that, and Sarah, to your earlier point, this is about communication. There are rights and responsibilities of residents, and there are rights and responsibilities of owners and operators of rental housing. We both have rights and responsibilities. Being sure that we understand a resident's responsibility is to pay rent, to behave in a way that's respectful as part of a community environment to both of the residents and the staff that serve. Owner operators, their main responsibility is to provide quality housing at all times and treat their residents fairly and with respect, and create the best customer service they can. So being sure we're communicating that both on the ground as well as from sort of a larger macro level. And when a conflict comes up, I think the best way to start that is to sit down and be like, okay, walking through even the lease. Sometimes I've done that where I've said, look, this is what your responsibility is. This is what my responsibility is. Here's what I've done. Here's what you've done. How do we get to a meeting of the minds first, and really having those one-on-one conversations, because it starts, to Todd's point, on a human level before you get into all the esoteric conversation around, does it fit into this protected class, or does it fit into this law, or does it fit into this person's idea. One thing we've done here at NMHC is we've put out something called the Foundations for Rental Housing, and it's a set of 6 principles that we think are the threshold for owner-operators of multifamily housing. And we now have 4.4 million units across the country signed on to it, 125 owner-operators in all 50 states and the District of Columbia. So the idea is that we can now communicate, here are 6 principles that a good owner-operator should be following and adhering to in their operation of their property. And continuing to try to have those conversations with residents so we can represent that and give people some sense of what that is, I think is a really helpful step. but I would welcome the opportunity to get out of these sort of litigious and contentious issues and take a different approach.
Suzanne,
And as a tenant
if I could,
voice-
oh, I'm sorry, Sarah.
I was gonna say, as a tenant voice on this panel, I think there's actually a lot of agreement here, which is really good to see. Like, I think all of us want, to Sharon's point, I agree 100% with her comments here about wanting to find a mutual place where both tenants and landlords are able to succeed and reach their goals. And it really does start with early proactive communication between tenants and landlords that's positive. And I think that that can go a long way to helping to head off problems when they do happen or resolving them when they can. Usually when we talk about things around litigation, we're thinking about those landlords who maybe might not be at this table, at this panel, and who aren't necessarily trying their best to serve their tenants in the way they can. There are certainly landlords who are out there who could benefit a lot from the resources that Sharon pointed out, and those that other folks on this panel are providing to help make sure that everybody's being treated respectfully.
And if I could just, I don't disagree with anything that's been said. I mean, I think people get into the business of providing housing for a variety of reasons. And even if you have providers who are making a profit, that doesn't mean that they're not interested in providing the best housing possible. I think, in my view, one of the tensions is, and Sharon mentioned this, the robust enforcement policy, that I think a lot of owners and managers have become kind of gun shy, if you will. They're afraid of over communicating. I mean, because there's the risk if you become too paternalistic with your tenants, then you might do something, of course, probably unintentionally, which might lead to a complaint. And even if a complaint is meritless, I would say HUD's or most agencies' process of screening complaints is not very effective. So then you're embroiled in this process, which takes time and money, etc. So I think, I don't know what the answer is, but I think that owners and managers have often been scared off from, being too communicative, and assuming, and maybe each side thinks the other side is evil. I don't know. So I don't know how you solve that, but I agree that there should be a way to kind of resolve that tension, or at least minimize it more.
And a side effect of that, and Todd, you were talking about this when we were planning this discussion, was that in marketing and in outreach, landlords and managers are a little more reticent to try new things and be innovative, because if it hasn't already been done, maybe it's not okay. I don't know if you want to talk some more about that.
Oh, I think that's right. I think I think I said fair housing can be used as sort of a shield and a sword. So there are times when we've said we want to do something and people say, well, we're not sure, if fair housing rules will allow that. It's sort of an easy thing to throw around. But there is a concern. I mean, gun shy, I think, is probably the best way to put it. There is a concern that any innovation will be used kind of against you because there's a way to view it as being done for one group, not another. So one of the things, though, we had talked about sort of how can you use innovation to actually, comply. And I think that, and I think, like everything else, technology is, if you use it in the right way, it can be a tool and it can be used for good or evil. So we have managers who are using technology, and they look at it as a way to promote fair housing compliance, being that if every notice goes out, is sent out by a system at the exact same time, no one can complain that we're discriminating against someone. If all the chatbots are checked to make sure that they're the way that they respond to questions are done in the right way, or if all the self-guided tours take everyone the exact same way, that those are ways that people can and are trying to build fair housing compliance into the new technology. But I think for people who don't have those type of resources, for smaller companies, it is fair housing is seen as a way that people are limited to do what they have seen others do. And so I think there is some it can I don't want to say retard. It can stop or slow innovation in certain groups because they're just gun shy. That anything you do, can and will be used against you. So yeah, I think that it's a real issue. And again, that's why I believe there should be more safe harbors or something. And I do, just to quickly go back to Sheila and Sharon, I do think that there are people who are thinking about leaving the affordable space. And sometimes here we conflate affordable with fair housing. But I think when we get to affordable, there are definitely people who think that, the testers are coming to send them out of business. The tenants just want to drive them out of business. It's an odd business in that everyone thinks they're wearing a white hat, but when they come together, everyone assumes that the other person is like the horrible person, is like the enemy who should be, put in prison. So that was a long-winded way of saying, yes, I do believe that fair housing can slow innovation, used properly. There are ways around it, but I agree.
And Sharon, you're nodding. What are some property management technologies that can help with fair housing compliance?
And this is a hot topic here in Washington around the use of technology in multifamily real estate. And while coming out of the gate, there's been a lot of publicity around its uses as a force of evil, or alleged uses for a force of evil. I don't believe that. I think it is a force of good. And like any other tool, it is one tool in the toolbox. Tools have to be used effectively. And I think as technology continues to evolve, we need to be sure that we have understanding, communication, safeguards around how tools can be used effectively. But a couple of the tools that do resident screening, there's been a lot of concern around those, and I think justifiable concern. However, ultimately, the responsibility for tenant screening and tenant selection remains with the owner operator of the property. So we're not delegating that to a machine and saying whatever the machine says is what we're going to do. And having spent some time at some of the companies that are developing some of these technology tools, there is great opportunity to actually take some bias out of this process and make a recommendation to the owner operator that even comes with less bias. There is nothing more biased than a human being. Each of us bring our background and our experience, our unique approach to things. Technology has the opportunity to do all the inputs of all the decisions that have been made by a bunch of human beings, go through and identify areas of bias and remove those or deflate those in a system where the recommendations that those systems will provide can actually have less bias coming forward. So I have a lot of concern about some of the political rhetoric around this, that we shouldn't be touching technology at all in this space. We should be embracing it cautiously. We shouldn't be running with knives toward it, but we should be testing it and making sure that the proper safeguards are there. But this has great opportunity to eliminate the very problem we're concerned about.
I'd love to build on that too, because I think there is great, promise with technology, so long as the technology isn't relying on inaccurate or biased data as like the underlying place. And that's where I think it gets a little challenging, because those third-party vendors aren't necessarily making their data sources transparent or revealing sort of where they're getting their data from. Tenants don't often have an opportunity to dispute if there's, if they're claiming something to my name, but somebody with a similar name has the issue, right? There has to be a way of having better transparency with the underlying data, and a way for tenants to be able to dispute data that they think might be incorrect and should correct it. And then I'll also just say, I think, Sharon's hitting on the new technology that's out there, but there's a lot of old techniques that I think are really helpful here too. And some of the best ways, I think, to stave off problems is, again, having that proactive conversations, proactive trauma-informed communication with tenants. And there are really great examples from landlords across the country who are doing this work already. Just wanted to lift up stewards for affordable housing for the future. Encourage you guys to check out their websites. They put out really great resources and, directed towards landlords. They're a group of nonprofit housing providers who share some of the best practices that they use at their properties to help make sure that they're getting ahead of problems, building strong relationships, and communicating openly. And some options that are available to landlords are things, Sharon mentioned about walking people through the lease terms, making sure there's mutual agreement about what responsibilities tenants have, what responsibilities landlords have, sharing policies in writing so people have that at the upfront. They can refer back to it and check in on it when there's an issue that arises. And I'll also say, making sure that the decisions that landlords are making are transparent. A lot of times the lack of transparency, feeds into this distrust between landlords and renters, but sharing up front, what are the tenant screening criteria that you use? Are those criteria relevant to the outcome and the success that a tenant might have? If there's a denial, maybe share the reason for the denial so that a renter could correct an issue if maybe the denial is based on inaccurate information and or mitigating circumstances. Some landlords have engaged and used resident councils. These are groups of residents who can give feedback regularly to landlords, and it's required within supportive housing, but other landlords use that as a model too to keep communication channels open between landlords and renters. And it's been really successful at making sure that we're solving problems as much as possible through dialogue.
Okay, thank you. We only have about 15 minutes left, so I'd like to turn to some audience Q&A, and I know we've still got some questions we could cover as well. So maybe we'll still get to some of those topics as well, but I want to give the audience an opportunity to have some questions answered. So the first one I'll start with is one that was sent in to us, which is how to approach culturally specific housing opportunities and needs while staying on the right side of fair housing. There've been housing marketing efforts and focuses over the years on specific groups. How do you make sure those aren't running up against being perceived as unfair housing, so to speak?
Can I say this was an example of where we were told not to do something. So we have a property that has a large Spanish speaking population, and I suggested, what marketing are we doing? There's got to be a Latino or Hispanic, Twitter, whatever, all this stuff, and was told that we shouldn't do that for fear of running afoul of fair housing. So I'd love to hear the answer to this, because I didn't send it in, I swear, but this is something that I've actually dealt with.
I honestly, I don't know how you address that, because I think the Fair Housing Act is very clear in that you cannot, express a preference for any one group over another group. And so, the Fair Housing Act, I think its goal is to be, to be inclusive. And while there might be some merit or some legitimate reasons why you want to focus on one group or another, people of the same ethnicity, for instance, may prefer to reside together. I don't see HUD sanctioning that at all. So I don't know that there is a way to do that.
So I want to just a quick comment. I'm in Texas. Spanish is now our base language in this state, over and above English. More people speak Spanish in this state. And our TAA, Texas Apartment Association, publishes the lease in Spanish. They don't publish it in Greek and Italian, Spanish. The fair housing poster, which I have with every client I work with, frame it, hang it on the wall, that explains exactly what fair housing is. So you can point out things if a resident comes in, how come they get to do that? They fall under one of these protected classes. But so in my training, I tell everybody, translation is our responsibility. If we do not speak Spanish, we have, you have your phone, you can translate on your phone with the conversation. So, but as far as people wanting to live, my granddaughter leased for me for many, many years. And she said, everybody who's leasing is from such and such country. Is that a problem? And I said, No, they have friends who live there. They want to live there too. They come in, we translate, we get them on a lease. So this has been going on since probably Adam and Eve, but it's certainly been going on the entire 55 years I've been in this industry, is how to deal with language barriers and with the issues that we're talking about. So enough said.
So let me ask another question. Overall, while rezoning has the potential to positively impact fair housing, its effectiveness depends on careful planning and considerations of local conditions. How effective has it been?
I think this might be a place where there's also agreement here, maybe that zoning reforms, land use reforms are urgently needed to help address the housing crisis. We have a severe shortage of housing, especially for the lowest income renters. And we need to be making sure that we're not putting artificial barriers in place that prevent housing from being built and that drive up housing costs. So that's critically important. But there's a little nuance to it too. I think zoning by itself is not enough. It's necessary, but not sufficient on its own. Because we need to make sure that we're also ensuring that when housing is being built, that it's truly available to everybody without discrimination, that those opportunities that are being created are accessible to everyone. And so it's important that we're not just replacing the word fair housing with zoning, which is something that, in my opinion, the Trump administration was doing with its AFFH rule. But we're thinking about them as both being complementary but distinct from one another.
Okay, anyone else? Okay,
I'll
see what
just add to that again.
Yeah.
I think we all agree housing supply is the answer to the question. Zoning is one piece of a broader puzzle. So it is one tool, but not everything in the toolbox. We need many more incentives for development, more financial support for development. And then to our earlier conversation, I think another thing that would be supportive, even if we built more housing, is federal investment in the rental housing counseling opportunities, so residents understand their rights and responsibilities in some of these circumstances. We seem to have lost some of that during COVID, and getting that back, I think, would be enormously helpful as well.
Okay. We've got a few questions concerned about, and I don't know if there's an answer here because we discussed it earlier, but the idea of whether or not to be able to screen for criminal records. How effective have criminal screenings been is one question. And then we've got another person observing that taking away the right to screen for that kind of history puts good tenants at risk. So I don't know if anybody's got more to say on that one, but it seems like there's a few people asking about the risks and concerns about criminal screenings.
So I want to throw in on that, and that is when criminal background first became protected in 2016, was added to the list. It was very broad. So every property thought that, they just screen them just like they do for past rental history, whatever else. Okay. But I think the most significant thing that is the most important, and HUD has made it pretty clear, you must take each case individually. You can't have a blanket policy. So that's my 2 cents worth that everybody needs to stay on top of. Individual screening, and there's a
so I'm not sure I understand. So when an individual screening, what is that? What are you doing?
That means you go.
One person is murder, it's okay. Another person's murder is not okay.
It means that you don't have a broad, if you've ever been in prison, period. You take each individual situation and we could spend another hour on that and we're out of time, and I don't mean to dominate, but I just want to make sure that if anybody who's listening has joined us has a blanket, this is how we do criminal background, we do this, that we do have to consider each individual situation and not just have a broad, and of course, so many of the properties today use the third party screening. And the third party screeners have had to step up and be sure that they're up to date on how they're doing it. So just wanted to mention, don't have a blanket policy, a blanket style. Sarah, you're nodding. You got a comment?
Yeah, I was just adding on to it. I mean, I think this is actually, of course, we always have to balance between making sure that current residents are safe and protected, and then making sure that people have access to housing. So in that individualized assessment that HUD's proposing, you would look at, is the landlord looking at arrests where maybe the person wasn't ultimately found guilty, or are they looking at convictions? Are they looking at how do you weigh a crime that might have occurred 25 years ago versus one that occurred 2 years ago? Is the crime that somebody or their conviction, was it about some petty small crime, or was it about something that goes straight to the heart of the health and safety of residents? And so I actually think that this proposed rule from HUD is a really good starting point to think about each individual case for its merits, thinking about how does this directly connect back to the health and safety of other tenants who are living in the property, while also making sure that we provide housing resources to folks who need it and give people a second chance. We also know that when policies are too strict and prevent people from getting access to the housing, it actually makes communities less safe. Because when people do want to re-enter their communities, they need a place to live. And if they can't find a safe place to live, it means that their recidivism rates go up. That means community safety and community in your community is more at risk. And so we need to take a little bit more nuance of an approach to addressing this issue than just saying categorically anybody who has an arrest record is no longer able to access housing.
Can I just respond quickly? Because I mean, I think that there's one of the things that I guess I think about through this whole thing is, are we being asked to do too much? So when you say, okay, it needs to be an individualized response. Okay, so, when maybe it should be blanket of everyone who's ever been convicted of anything or accused of anything at any time should do it. But if you're saying that, each person has to decide whether, this crime went to the true rights or responsibility, whatever, involved in living in an apartment versus something else. Now we're being asked to make societal judgments about it. And then if a different person, works there and makes a different decision, are we at risk of a fair housing claim because, someone comes back and looks at it and says, well, that didn't really go to, whatever I'm sorry, I forgot your words, but, whatever it needs to be, is not germane to living there. I mean, yes, you're right. If people don't have a place to live when they re-enter, then there are problems. But that's a societal problem that it seems like you're trying to, or HUD's trying to foist onto private operators. And I'm not sure if that's fair. That there's a societal problem, so you people handle it. I keep coming back to, and in my mind, I keep playing. We have because now everybody has cameras. There's this video of this woman who complained about her next door neighbor, and he comes out, and I won't use the word, but he just starts screaming. He goes, "So where's your gun at?" And it's like, that's not fair to that person who just happens to live next door to this guy who had all sorts of problems. But we're so concerned about taking, either it's 30 days or whatever the requirements are, that we actually can't, or we're hampered in our ability to provide safe, affordable, safe housing for the rest of the tenants.
If I could just add on to what Todd is saying, I think that is the tension, and I think the position or that we've taken is in some respects that's the HUD is trying to turn housing providers into social workers and social scientists. For instance, in the proposed rule, it requires or would say that any look back period beyond 3 years would be presumptively unreasonable. And you could get that exception if you could provide empirical evidence. Well, what landlord or provider has the ability to find published studies that would justify a look back period beyond 3 years for a particular crime? So I think it needs to be a more holistic approach, for, people who are coming out of from incarceration who need to re-enter society. It shouldn't be the provider's responsibility to take everyone in without additional social services perhaps in place to help these people reintegrate into society. Simply finding a place to live in many cases is not going to be sufficient to help these people effectively or successfully reintegrate into society. And I think going back to the original question, is there any indication that criminal screening is effective? Or I don't think there's any. I think that varies. I don't think there's a specific one answer to that question. Anna said, I agree. And I tell my clients they should not have blanket policies, but blanket policy, like anyone ever convicted of murder, no matter how long ago it was, may not be a reasonable policy. Everything should be reasonable. But HUD is pushing the envelope, in my opinion, to some extent. They're changing provisions of the statute, the QARA, the changing, it has to be a threat. Someone's criminal history has to demonstrate a threat rather than it interferes with. Well, that's an entirely different standard. So they're changing words and standards without any real justification. And that's the kind of thing that providers are looking at and saying, I don't know if I can do this anymore.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. This has been a really interesting conversation, and there's so many more aspects we could address, and this topic alone would be interesting to talk about further. But it does sound like going back to on the ground management, funneling things to one point person who can then take the time to address all of this could certainly be very helpful. Sorry if we didn't get to all of your questions. We will certainly try to take them into consideration as we do some follow-up content in this area. We did record this, and we'll be sending you all a link when the recording's available. If you're focused on affordable housing, do look out for our communications on a webinar from Yardi Matrix that's taking place next week, as well as our own MHN Voices webinar in December. And in addition, we'll be hosting a Snap Session webinar next month focused on Gen Z, sponsored by American Express. Thank you to our speakers once again for this very, very interesting, in-depth discussion. Greatly appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us today.
Everyone.
Thank you.